Welcome back to another Friday edition of Bad News. We're brought to you by The Federalist and the National Journalism Center. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
Now, of course, we call Bad News the media criticism show the right deserves because, as always, we bring media criticism and commentary to you without any illusions that the media is redeemable, because the legacy media at this point is both incompetent and corrupt, as we cover every single week, twice a week on this show. So make sure that you subscribe. The first story of the three that we're going to cover today is pretty new. This is right now, if you look, it's just gone up on the Federalist, and I will share the tab as soon as I can. We have a new story up by reporter Jordan Davidson, headlined, "Media Won't Retract Anonymously Sourced Claims That Colonial Pipeline Refused to Pay $5 million in ransom." And so here's the story. Basically, there was a handful of corporate media outlets who decided, or I guess who decided that they were going to run with the narratives that were given to them by anonymous sources, as Jordan walks through in this article. That would be the Washington Post, CNN, and I believe Reuters. So these are, purportedly straight news outlets, ran with a story from anonymous sources that said Colonial Pipeline would likely not, or would not be paying ransom, the $5 million of ransom, to the pipeline hackers. Now, we know that that's not what happened. Eventually, we know that they did pay the hackers. And so CNN added a little update to its story written by Russia hoaxer Natasha Bertrand that said, and I guess four other people on the byline for some reason that's impossible to decipher, that said they, updated the story to reflect that Colonial Pipeline did pay the hackers. Ben, is this yet another example of something that we've talked about multiple times over the past month, which is that these outlets seem to all be relying on the same terrible anonymous sources to misinform the public?
Yeah, I mean, they continue to indict themselves. I'm not really clear what the angle from their perspective was here in terms of running with this sourcing that apparently proved dubious and incorrect, and now why they're being intransigent in terms of retracting. There is obviously the time pressure to be the first out with a scoop to the extent you have it. But how do they all get it wrong simultaneously? And
Right.
then, was there some political reason why they felt the need to say that no ransom was paid? Like, what was the government's involvement essentially in the negotiations with these cyber terrorists essentially?
Yeah.
And maybe that's one of the reasons why, because they don't want us to know what actually was transpiring. And what the Biden administration's sort of relationship was to the negotiations. But then the other aspect that I'd point out is this is the same week where the media, the New York Times, would not report that there were gas shortages and lines everywhere across the country, particularly on the East Coast where the pipeline largely runs for Colonial. So you look at this and it's just a mess of reporting. And how many big stories are they going to get wrong, supposedly, due to not doing their actual due diligence, basic journalism? And that's why you have to question at some level, we talk about the bias and the malfeasance associated with it, and the media is really good at essentially tarring and feathering their adversaries and manipulating narratives to go after them. But at some point, maybe they're just bad journalists.
No, they are
totally given up on the basic, shoe leather principles that govern this industry for eternity until now.
No, they are. And this is a perfect, I'm so glad you said that, because that's what's happening is they're swallowing the narratives of their sources. In this case, they seem to be from Colonial Pipeline, that are using them to advance a narrative. And what they're doing is swallowing that narrative uncritically, relying on anonymous sources instead of saying these people are anonymous because maybe they're selling you BS. And that's why they want to remain anonymous. Let's at least bring in these other sources who have different information, or let's at least wait until we can get somebody on the record, or let alone on background, which means they don't attach their name to the information, just, some sort of vague identifier, and, wait until somebody is willing to stick their neck out in some way whatsoever for this. And so instead they sort of swallow these narratives uncritically. Their editors let them get away with publishing them. And so there you go. That's how it happens. And so I think it's important to say that it's not always bias. It's actually downstream of this total incompetence. And that's what I think we saw happen. You raised a good point. Let's talk about it briefly, in that you had news outlets that were based in some of these coastal enclaves downplaying the gas shortage that was wreaking havoc in certain communities, saying that it wasn't widespread yet, even though you had, it wasn't the whole country, but you would feel that it was widespread if you were in some of these places that were dealing with gas shortages, and you were watching, your neighbors a couple states away deal with the same thing. And this is downstream of the sort of the coming apart effect that we talk about so often. I literally use this in my speeches to students to say one of the big cultural differences between the reporters who cover the rest of the country is that they live in cities and they don't have cars. And how fortuitous that this example came to us this week before they all botched the story, relying on the same anonymous sources. It's another great case study in their cultural issues.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and then of course there's the political angle to it as well. But it really does always come down to this question of incompetence or intentional malfeasance, and then just myopia and not even realizing that there's a whole great big world out there, and issues that don't affect our betters in the media do disproportionately affect everyone outside their little bubbles.
That's a great point. Ben, we can segue now into another story, and this is one that you wanted to talk about, and I hadn't actually seen it yet. But why don't you tee this one up? We're going to talk about the New York Times' new reporting. It came out yesterday on Project Veritas and some of the problems that you can see with it.
Yeah, so if you hadn't looked at this story, this is a story with, I think, 3 or 4 reporters at the New York Times. And there are just so many elements to this that make it an amazing case study in witnessing what our media does. Obviously, Project Veritas has been tarred and feathered as engaging in shoddy journalism and selective editing and the like. And consequently, Project Veritas has been engaged in litigation with lots of different outlets and entities who attack the sort of reputation of Project Veritas. Others might make the argument that the reason they're going after Project Veritas is that they're effective at what they do, which is typically aiming to expose bias and corruption and the like. This article, and you can see on the screen, activists and ex-spy sets have plotted to discredit Trump enemies in government. Essentially, what the article talks about is the fact that supposedly operatives who at some point worked for Project Veritas were engaged in different operations to try and collect compromising audio from the then National Security Advisor, McMaster, as well as others in the FBI. And the article makes the case that there was an, as they said, ex-British spy who's associated with Eric Prince, another boogeyman of the left, a former Blackwater CEO, essentially saying that they helped sort of engineer these operations. And supposedly there were honeypot operations where people were set undercover to have drinks in a social setting with FBI agents and try to collect audio that would show the animus towards the administration they were supposed to serve. In any event, nothing ever came of it, clearly, with respect to the National Security Advisor. And it does not seem that anything happened with this FBI officials that allegedly these individuals came in contact with. But there are a few really shoddy things associated with this piece that are amazing, beyond the fact that, of course, there's this subtext of ex-British spy. So, of course, foreign collusion, because the Project Veritas ex-British spy is evil, but Steele, of course, could do no wrong. And, of course, the Times does not delve into that irony associated with this. The Times does not let readers know up front that they are embroiled in litigation with Project Veritas right now. You have to go down like 10 or 15 paragraphs in the story to see that very critical disclosure when they're writing about Project Veritas, that they're embroiled in litigation with Project Veritas right now, and not doing particularly well, by the way, which might in part explain why they were working on this story. Another aspect of it, it says that the group Project Veritas essentially, and I'm not going to quote here, but paraphrasing, was involved with this effort. Later on, it says, essentially, they cannot establish that Project Veritas, the organization, oversaw the effort or who funded the effort. So they contradict themselves later on in the story. And last but not least, they quote a statement from James O'Keefe, the founder of Project Veritas and the chairman and CEO as well, basically saying, this is an attempt by the Times to smear Project Veritas, including while they're engaged in litigation. And it says that O'Keefe also produced a video in response to the Times. In that video, O'Keefe unequivocally says he had no involvement with any of this stuff that went on, but the Times does not print the relevant quotes. So on several levels, this is dubious journalism. It's not disclosing critical items that you ought to know. It's alleging something up front and then contradicting a pretty big claim later on in the story. And it seems to be essentially supposition and innuendo about the relationship of this organization to whatever these plots were that didn't seem to amount to anything. So all around, I think this is a perfect illustration, again, of where the media is trying to essentially pick off and undermine anyone who would be deemed an adversary of theirs. And then just, again, not following basic journalistic protocol in so doing. And again, you have to go to, is it that they're bad journalists? Is it that they're intentionally obfuscating in a situation like this? Or is it something else? Nevertheless, I'd urge everyone to keep an eye on the Project Veritas slander suit and defamation suit against the Times as it plays out, and then watch how the Times reports on Project Veritas going forward. And Byron York, I should say, had a great argument about what's happening in that case as the judge allows the case to proceed. This may become another exhibit in that case.
You know, it's funny to me because Project Veritas exists to sort of expose the bias of the corporate press and of the legacy media. And the legacy media sort of despises them and has contempt and ridicules them. But what's interesting is that they just give them more ammunition to work with and continue to sort of prove the premise right in their efforts to discredit them or in their efforts to sort of prove them wrong. They end up sort of proving them right, like not disclosing that up top is such an obvious flouting of journalistic ethics. I mean, you can't just sort of dispense with, I don't think that would have happened, 30 years ago. And that's something that we talk about a lot. The media has always been biased, but it's not always been like this. This is on another level. And we get into why that is all of the time. It's because you have all of the injection of the millennial staffers who operate under this very stringent worldview. But that's sort of aside. It's amazing to me that how often the corporate press just gives Project Veritas so much ammunition to work with. I mean, it's actually pretty incredible, some of the stuff that they've gotten out of CNN in particular, that it hasn't been a bigger story. I mean, it's obvious why the media hasn't wanted to cover it. But like, again, this is a great example and a case study in how if it bleeds, it leads is not a true maxim anymore. That's not to say people don't in the media put things that are bleeding in the lead because they do want clicks and money and everything. That still happens, but it doesn't necessitate coverage anymore in the way that it used to. People say, journalists can't resist a good story. But the stuff that Project Veritas has videotaped, even if you can't even make the argument that some of it has been selectively edited, because what's actually on there, whether or not it's been selectively edited, is so damning and so bad. Do you think it's kind of amazing how some of those stories were just like news cycles and conservative press?
Yeah. And, I think that there's an interesting element of this which transcends ideology. If you take a look at James O'Keefe's book that he wrote several years back, and you look at what his philosophy and the organization's stated philosophy is, it's not like right-wing hatchet jobs on people. They don't trust the powerful, and so they do sort of sting operations and the like to try to expose them. And as reflected right here, that includes going after people, seemingly, although it doesn't seem like it was Project Veritas driven, even people in an administration that, people would assume they were generally supportive of. And, again, in the past, they've gone after, I believe, Republicans as well as Democrats, and probably have more disdain, I would suspect, for sort of rhinos in the Republican Party than the overt leftists on the other side who are more open and honest about their ideology. So what is this really about at the end of the day? I suspect that part of the animus towards Project Veritas, and this is just pseudo-informed speculation, so take it for what it's worth, but is they don't like the fact that there's this little shoestring operation that actually goes and gets these scoops, because they do the traditional sort of operations that journalists would engage in, as opposed to calling up a contact at the FBI or the DOJ or CIA and reporting verbatim what is handed to them and running with that narrative. So I suspect it transcends ideology, and it's in part about, once again, the kind of independent upstart that ends up getting scoops that they don't get because they do the hard work that the journalists don't want to do anymore.
I could not think of a more perfect segue into the next topic when you said an independent upstart that goes after the scoops that they don't, because what we're going to talk about in this next segment is a 24-minute video, little mini documentary that the Intercept put together. And the Intercept, by the way, used to be an outfit that had Glenn Greenwald, and we know that Glenn left on not so great terms and continues to say, you know, this organization used to stand up against the powerful, and now it just basically carries their water for them. Here we have Meet the Riot Squad, right-wing reporters whose viral videos are used to smear BLM. I'm really surprised that The Intercept ran this. I'm also not surprised that The Intercept ran this because it has been trending towards weird millennial woke progressivism, and that is to say cultural leftism prioritized over the it's shifted as the cultural left has sort of co-opted the broader progressive left. The Intercept has sort of shifted along with it. So in that sense, I'm not surprised, but it's actually really sad to see from an outlet that does some really good journalism. I mean, this is one of the publications that I read all of the time because there's some great reporting in it, but this is nonsense. They're basically smearing the group of hardworking ass kicking and busting reporters, Julio Rosas, Jorge Ventura, Shelby Talcott, Richie McGinnis of the Daily Caller, of Town Hall, who have busted their butts out on the streets for a year, putting themselves in dangerous situations. A man was shot right next to Richie in Kenosha. Shelby has gone to jail. Julio has to be so careful about his security. It's unbelievable to document the violence in American cities. And what's interesting about these reporters in particular is that they're incredibly fair. They work for right of center news outlets, but they're incredibly fair. And they're there when the legacy media leaves, when the reporters from the legacy media head home, when things get too dangerous. These guys have been in the fray and have documented some really important stuff over the course of the last year. The Intercept's argument is basically the argument that I think a lot of people make against Andy Ngo of the Post Millennial, which is that he is, just a smear merchant in it for clicks who cherry picks examples and blows them up to be representative of BLM as a whole and to create this vast right-wing narrative of violence. For instance, the piece takes issue with the fact that Senator Ron Johnson cited that 500 riots turned violent and over the course of the last year, but he failed to mention, that was out of a much larger number, like 1,500 or something like that. But again, this is just clearly they're documenting the violence, and the violence is clearly happening. 500 is a lot. Even as a tiny percentage of the overall protests, 500 is a lot. So the smear piece is just so stupid. It's like something you would read from a college student. I don't know. What did you think about it, Ben?
So many responses, and one of them being like Andy Ngo faces potential death, in this country as a consequence of what he's exposed. So who the hell is the media to go after him, given all of the crap that he has been through as a consequence of reporting on these episodes? The other thing is, that this is just a smear hatchet job because there are some people on the left who have also done similar work. And who comes to mind is Michael Tracy. You can check his stuff out on Substack. He's gone back to Kenosha post-riots. He's gone to Minneapolis recently, which he wrote a piece where I think he called it Murderopolis because there's been a massive spike post-George Floyd and the Derek Chauvin episode. So obviously they don't care to write about someone on the left who honestly writes about the wreckage that's been left after this anti-cultural revolution rolled through the country. And the other thing is Matt Taibbi wrote a piece this week where he talked about essentially that, wow, we've come a long way in 10 years where our media, including the likes of places like The Intercept, used to be about exposing government corruption, targeting of people, et cetera. And now publications like The Intercept are targeting American citizens themselves and essentially serving as auxiliaries or ancillaries to the effort that the government itself may or may not be engaged in. And I think this is a perfect reflection of the fact that the Intercept essentially has become, in some measure, exactly everything that it hated and that it opposed. This is the perfect representation of it. Obviously they're leftists, and we disagree with them probably on the narratives that they put forth. But at the same time, when they actually go and get quality, credible material with sourcing, and they expose something that's important and shouldn't matter what side it comes from, this damages that credibility in terms of being seen and at all acting in good faith. And, they were always left, but it's different when you're sort of left libertarian, let's say, or at least you're not an illiberal leftist, versus what this is, which is just pure partisan attacking your purported political adversaries. And it's sad to see, and it's shameful.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's the thing. It's like the truth is simply that it's not as though BLM overall is, 99% rioters and violent. But the fact of the matter is that there have been serious threats. There have been millions of dollars, probably billions of dollars of damage across the entire country because riots and violence have started by supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement. That's not to say the entire movement is violent, but the premise is absolutely true that supporters of BLM have been violent in ways that are newsworthy. And it's impossible to deny their newsworthiness when you look at the fact. And the objection, essentially, if you boil it down, is to the newsworthiness of these stories, saying these are not newsworthy because because they're not representative and because they're cherry picked and they're small. Even if they're not representative, however, they are newsworthy because they're putting livelihoods and lives in danger in localities all around the country. These are a big deal in a lot of the communities. I remember when this happened in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, which is right outside of Milwaukee, and then it came to Kenosha. And there are stories about it happening in, outside of our big metropolises, hitting the main street in America, and doing serious damage to our big metropolises, like here in Washington, D.C. Even if it is a small group of people, it's affecting a whole lot of people in meaningful and significant ways. And I think to pretend that's not happening shows how post-truth our cultural left is right now. And it's a slap in the face of the working people whose businesses and properties we documented what happened to so many people's businesses, small businesses in Kenosha. This is just a slap in the face to the working people whose lives were upended in very newsworthy ways by the violence that supporters of Black Lives Matter of the movement fomented over the course of the last year, and from a publication that's supposed to back workers. It's just outrageous and stupid, and it does show how far the left has its head in the sand when it comes to things like this, because they're not really, they dismiss reflexively so much stuff as a right-wing narrative just because it comes out of right-wing sources.
And as you alluded to in this particular matter, it's 7% of events were proven violent of like thousands of events across the country. So, they love to play these games with the numbers, and they themselves are engaging in projection by talking about cherry picking here. One could make a case. For example, how many riots like that occurred from MAGA hat wearers in this country? I think they would pretty much only point to a single event that's ever happened, and that may be an outsized, disproportionate event. It certainly led to substantially less damage than what happened over the last summer, substantially fewer deaths and beyond. They would never want to count. They would never want to deal with, they would say, how could you ever make that case when you're talking about something that's on the level of the Civil War and 9/11 and Pearl Harbor. But it's really just maddening the way that anyone can play games with numbers, but they really are playing games with numbers. Another perfect example of this, I've been doing a lot of digging into the government's claims that right-wing or far-right extremists, domestic violent extremists, pose the greatest threat of any across the country. And they like to point to the fact that over the last 2 years, there's been a surge in such terrorist incidents or plots associated with them. And if you look at the absolute number that we're talking about here, thank God, it's a very small number of people involved with a very small number of events, thankfully with a very small number of casualties. But leaving aside the issues of relative versus absolute numbers and percentage increases versus what it actually looks like, the amazing thing is I've now seen in 2 hearings on this one held by, I believe, the Senate Appropriations Committee and another, I believe, in the House Appropriations Committee on violent extremism. The people chairing the hearings continue to point to one report from CSIS, a prominent sort of mainstream supposed think tank, which has a database of domestic terror incidents. And when you look at the Washington Post write-up of CSIS, and they've worked together on this database, what they admit, the Post, like 15 lines in again, is that actually they don't classify the events of the last summer, the unrest and the violence, one way or the other, because they can't ascribe an ideology to that violence. So the entire basis, it seems, of which our government officials are saying that domestic violent extremists are composed of right-wing, far-right extremists and the like, is a number that excludes everything that's happened over the last year from the left. So, leaving aside the fact that it's all wrong, no matter what side it's from, once again, you see the cherry picking and playing with the numbers, and I think it dovetails with this sort of smear effort that you're talking about with this story.
Listen, the public would choose Richie McGinnis over Ali Velshi's fiery but mostly peaceful coverage 9 out of 10 times, if not 10 out of 10 times. And it's because it's much more accurate. It is accurate. It's trustworthy. It's newsworthy, and it's the real story. And in the absence and the vacuum created by the legacy media not telling the real story, there's a huge demand for people who are willing to tell the real story and who are willing to put in the blood, sweat, and tears to get the real story when the legacy media packs up and goes home. That's not to say there aren't some real shoe leather reporters left in the legacy media, because they are. They are there. They don't always get their due because they're so crowded out by the woke millennials. But you should take these guys over that team any day because they do the hard work. They're total badasses. We support them completely here. They're actually a model of what journalism should be. So it's very telling to see leftist journalists holding them up as examples of what journalists shouldn't be, because it's completely the opposite. They go to the story. They don't care about the narrative. They don't care who's fomenting the violence. They document people on both sides fomenting violence, and they break their necks to do it. They're really hard workers. They're great journalists. So what a stupid hit piece. It's not going to, really leave a mark on them, but we wanted to make sure we covered it here.
Yeah, they're doing their job is what that story reflects, and amen to the job that they're doing. And now I just can't get the Ali Velshi image out of my head, the sort of Naked Gun, move along, nothing to see here as the world is exploding behind them. That's a perfect illustration of our propaganda corporate media.
I was just going to say, it's the perfect symbol. Well, on that note, this has been another edition of Bad News. We're here every Wednesday and Friday. We're brought to you by the Federalist and the National Journalism Center. Please subscribe so that you can get every episode into your social media or your YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts like this. Until next time, I'm Emily Jashinsky.